Which part? Well, all right. Well, I had you a PowerPoint. Am I on? No. I had you a PowerPoint, and I worked all afternoon on it, and then I didn't upload it to the server. I didn't have my computer. I don't have my phone. So my wife just happened to have her computer, but for some reason it's not emailing to the loft, so you're out of luck tonight. That's how my afternoon's going. How's yours going? Brian, what? Let's leave, they said? You might want to. All right. Okay, I give up. Well, good evening. I wish Matt were teaching tonight instead of me. Yeah. All right. I do appreciate Matt filling in last week, doing a great job. I appreciate Billy filling in for me a couple weeks ago, even though he threw me under the bus and talked about me not being here. I heard about that. But I have been away at camp the last 2 weeks, and went really well. I am extremely tired right now. So I think this is my 13th lesson in the last 15 days teaching. And so I'm looking forward to not teaching for a few days after tonight. But we'll get through this tonight. If you want to go ahead and open up to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11. And as you're turning there, I want you to think about the fact that good Lord is smiling down on Justin tonight. All right. I just did it. I think. Yeah. Oh, all right. Our choices reveal what we truly value. Okay? And what I mean by that is the choices you make show really what you value. You know, if you really value being healthy, right? If you really value, your blood work. I had blood work done this past week while I was away at camp. I always go get my annual physical. So I had blood work done. If you value your health and the numbers on your blood work, then the choices you make will reveal that. You know, the food that you eat. I won't eat so much fried food. I wouldn't eat so many sweets. If I truly valued that. Obviously, I don't value it enough, apparently, right? If you value, that stuff, then obviously you're probably going to exercise more. I know there are some people that go to the gym pretty consistently sitting here tonight, If you value saving money, then the choices you make will reveal that. You won't blow your money. You'll be very cautious maybe about how you spend money. Some people maybe even give you a nickname and call you cheapskate because you just value saving money, right? Tonight, the guy that we're going to study about, the choices he makes reveals what he truly values in life. And we're going to see this as we talk about him tonight. Obviously, tonight I'm talking about Moses. At least that's what I think. I had my wife look at my slides like right before we left, and I had something about Noah in there. That's where my mind is tonight. So I'm talking about Moses, but if I call him Peter, just go with me tonight. So we're going to pick up Hebrews chapter 11, beginning in verse number 23. It says, by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict. It's interesting to me when you think about, we talk about the hall of faith, and generally it begins with the phrase by faith, and it names a person. And here it names the person Moses. But what's interesting is the first verse isn't about Moses. The first verse where his name is mentioned is actually about the faith of his parents, right? And what's it reveal about the faith of his parents? What'd you say, Tommy? What's his name? I done forgot. Charles. What'd you say, Charles? His name is Stephen if you're visiting with us tonight. That's an inside joke. What did you say, Stephen? He wasn't afraid of the king. Yeah, they weren't afraid of the king's edict. Okay, what was the king's edict? Think about the time period that Moses grew up in, right? The children of Israel are in Egypt. They're serving as slaves here in Egypt. And what you see is this faith of Moses' parents demonstrated for us, that the faith that they have in God, because as you read in Exodus chapter 1, you find out that they're living in a time when this king arose, this Pharaoh over Egypt, who doesn't know Joseph, what Joseph has done for Egypt. And so he wants to make life hard for the Israelites because he's afraid, hey, if they grow, if they continue to multiply, then they're going to team up basically with our enemies. They're going to turn against us, and we're going to be in trouble. So he says, there in verse 9, the end of verse 9 or verse 10, he says, come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, right? We want to make life really, really difficult for them. And so you keep reading there in Exodus chapter 1, and you find out that he makes them work as slaves. He makes, it says, life bitter with hard service. A lot of manual labor that they're participating in. And he's doing this because he's trying to wear them out, right? He's trying to keep them from multiplying, but the more he does this, the more they multiply. And eventually, he decides, okay, we've got to do something. We've got to try to put a stop to this. And so he calls the chief midwives and basically tells them, hey, if the Hebrews have a baby boy, I want you to kill him. Well, you know the story. You know they don't do that, right? And they say, hey, we can't get to them fast enough before they give birth. And when he decides, hey, if the midwives aren't going to help me, he turns to all the people of Egypt. And he basically makes them his little spies. And he says, hey, every son that is born to the Hebrews, you need to cast in the Nile, but you can let the daughters live. And so basically, this is the time period when the parents, or when Moses is born, and his parents have a decision to make. And they chose to try to hide a baby. Now, most of us, when we have babies, we don't try to hide them, right? We show them off, right? We want everybody to see the beautiful baby. But Moses' parents, for 3 months, it says, does their best to hide this child. And why does verse 23 say they wanted to hide the child? What's it tell us? What did they see? That he was a beautiful. Now that sounds a little interesting, I mean, in one sense, because you think, well, he was a good-looking baby. I mean, a lot of babies are cute, right? Babies tend to be beautiful. I've seen a few not so beautiful babies, but for the most part, all the babies here at Walter Hill, they're beautiful. So if it's your grandchild, they're beautiful. I'm not talking about them, because most babies are beautiful, but I don't think necessarily that may be what it's talking about. Based on Acts chapter 7, verse number 20, when Stephen is talking about the history of Israel, he talks about Moses being beautiful in God's sight. So the idea seems to be, though Jewish tradition says it had to do with his appearance, that Moses was a very beautiful individual. But based on Acts 7, verse 20, it seems that it has to do probably more with the fact that some way, somehow, his parents, whether that was through a vision, a dream, or something happened, they realized, hey, there was something special about this baby. And God was going to use this baby to do great things for his people. And so they're willing to hide him. And they're willing to break basically the law of the king at this point. And what I want you to see as we begin, because we're going to talk about the faith of Moses, but I want you to see the faith of his parents and what his parents demonstrate for us. His parents demonstrate that faith never bows down to fear. Faith doesn't bow down to fear. I think for a lot of us, we need to remember this. Because we live in a world where we allow fear to dictate our level of faith a lot of times, instead of our faith, really dictating whether or not we're afraid. We do it the opposite way. As you think about this idea of faith, can you think of examples in Scripture of individuals whose faith didn't bow down to fear? Yeah, I think that was the first one I thought of when I was reviewing this afternoon. The thought of the 3 Hebrew boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right, when they're thrown in the fiery furnace. Right? They could have bowed down to that image. They didn't have to say, hey, okay, you know what? I'm going to bow down. I don't want to go in that fiery furnace. They were given, Nebuchadnezzar gave them another chance. Even after he said, if you don't bow down, you're going to be cast in. They didn't bow down. And then when they told Nebuchadnezzar about it, he was like, I'll give you one more chance. He gave them another opportunity. And in the midst of that, they still refused to bow down because faith never bows down to fear. Can you think of another example? Joshua and Caleb. Okay. When they were sent out to spy out the land. Okay, that's good. Daniel. Daniel a couple different times, I guess, in the opening chapter of the book of Daniel with, refusing the king's food. I think also in chapter 6, right? That's the one I think most people think about, in the lion's den, okay? Can you think of any others? Okay, David, when he defeated Goliath. What about in the New Testament? Paul? Okay, Stephen's a good one, right? Stephen. Who said Paul? Somebody said Paul. Paul? Okay, give me an example from Paul. I know. That's why I said give me an example. His whole life. I taught a couple of weeks ago, I had to teach a series on the Apostle Paul and his missionary journeys. And it's interesting the number of times when Paul is doing his missionary work, going on these journeys, when Paul faced opposition, when Paul faced moments of fear, right? And he demonstrates each and every time his faith. His faith didn't bow down. He didn't cower down. He was even stoned because he wouldn't stop teaching and preaching. So you got Paul. Anybody else you can think about in the New Testament? Stephen? Anybody else? Yeah, there's that trump card. Jesus, right? Yeah. The elder goes straight for it. I'll say it. Yeah, Jesus, obviously. Nobody wants to say anymore now. We hit Jesus. We need to just move on now, right? I think about the apostles too, right, and their life. I mean, especially after the resurrection, like in the book of Acts, we only have a little bit of the history recorded for us of what took place in the life of the apostles, and a lot of it centered on Peter. But all the apostles, as they were going out, were being persecuted, right? Even the early Christians in Acts chapter 8 were being persecuted. The persecution was so great that it caused the Christians to basically leave or spread out from Jerusalem because it was so great. Yet the gospel continued to spread, right? The church continued to grow because faith doesn't bow down to fear. So we learned that about the parents for Moses, his parents. But what I want you to see is the faith that the parents had actually influenced, I believe, the faith of Moses. And remember, Moses' parents only had him for a short period of time. For 3 months, they hide him. Eventually, he ends back up in his mother's care for somewhere between, some people think 3 and 6 years, perhaps, that his mom is nursing him and taking care of him. But eventually, he finds himself in the palace, right? He's basically the adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter. But where the influence shows up is what you read in verse 24. Look at verse 24. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Moses, on this occasion, it says, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. That word refused is an interesting word because it's written in the aorist tense, which signifies it's talking about a specific moment. And so there's a Jewish tradition, Jewish historians who say that what it's referring to is basically the crown. That basically Moses was next in line to be the Pharaoh. That Moses was going to be the one, he was the handpicked one, or the chosen one, you might say, who was going to replace the Pharaoh. It's believed that the Pharaoh at that time, and I can't think of his name right now, I'm sorry, but anyway, he had a daughter. It was his only daughter. She was married, and she had no children, no sons. And so when she found Moses and adopted him and brought him up as her son, that the Pharaoh loved his daughter so much that he made the promise to her that her son would be the one who would follow him on the throne. And so a lot of the Jewish historians reference the fact that what Moses is refusing here when it says he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter is he's refusing to be the king. He's basically demonstrating that he's going to choose God's people suffering, which we're going to read about in a minute, suffering and being mistreated with God's people rather than enjoying the privileges that are going to come with the fact that, hey, he's basically the son or the grandson, we might say, of the king. He was willing to walk away from that. And as we think about this idea of what it is that Moses gave up, right? What is it he refused? There's a few things that I think about that come to my mind. Number one, being the son of Pharaoh's daughter, so the son of the Pharaoh, perhaps even the one who was promised to take over the throne himself at some point in time, by refusing this, he gave up honor and power. What kind of honor do you think Moses had being the grandson to the Pharaoh? Okay, being treated by royalty. Think about how we treat, I hate to use the term royal people in America, but famous people, right? Well-to-do people, how they're treated, right? They're treated differently, right? And people fall down at their feet and want to snap pictures with them, right? It's all like, hey, you're so great, you're this, you're that, right? The level that Moses probably received that would be to even probably a greater extent because of who he is. The grandson to the king of Egypt, right? A very powerful world power at this point in time. You think about the power that he would have had, right? Not only living there in the palace, not only being the grandson, but ultimately if he would have not refused to be the son and would have taken the throne, he would have had a lot of power. There are some historians that speculate that even while he was living in the palace before he left there in the latter part of, or the second half of his life that we read about at 40 years old, that he was one of the most important people in Egypt, that Pharaoh had already made him basically like second in command as the way you and I would see it in that country. And he's going to walk away from that. And I was trying to think what that would be like in our culture. You know, like that would be like the person who's like, you know, about to be like, they're the next in line to maybe the CEO of the company or the president of the company. And one day they walk in and they tell the boss, you know what, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to work for this company. I don't want to be the president. I don't want to be the CEO. Instead, I'm going to go down the road and I'm going to work for Chick-fil-A. You know, and listen, I love me some Chick-fil-A. But, you know, it would be absurd for somebody to walk away from such a high honor, such a high privilege to just go and work at Chick-fil-A. And I love Chick-fil-A, you know, but that's a lot of power. That's a lot of honor to walk away from. But Moses was willing to do that. So what does Moses' faith demonstrate for us here when you think about the fact that he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter? Well, I think the answer is faith refuses to identify with the world no matter what the world offers. Moses understood all the riches, all the power, all the honor that he could have if he stayed in that spot, if he stayed in his place, so to speak, this adopted family of his. But he also understood if I do that and if I identify with the world, then I'm turning my back on God's people. I'm turning back on my heritage, right, on my people. And he wasn't willing to do that no matter what could have been offered to him. And I think about us today and how kind of this relates to us today. You know, for us, it's easy, isn't it, to want to identify with the world around you? Like we think this is something that we talk about with kids. You know, kids, be careful. Don't be like the world, right? You know, don't be conformed to the world. Romans 12, 1 and 2. Don't do that. But it's a struggle for all of us because we like to fit in, because we don't want to be different, because we don't want to be viewed as being weird. And so for us, you know, sometimes it's hard because, you know, I want to be a person of faith. I want to identify with God and God's word. But at the same time, I also want to keep one foot over here in the world, and I want to have what the world offers too. And faith, listen, faith doesn't operate that way. Faith says, you know what, I'm going to refuse what the world offers, no matter what it is, because I want to identify with God's people. I want to choose to be on God's side. I think about James. You have to go to the next slide. It's not working all of a sudden. I've done something. James chapter 4, where James says, you adulterous people, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy with God. Right? And we use this verse and we talk about the fact that, hey, you can either be a friend of God and be on God's side, or you can be a friend of the world, and you can basically make yourself an enemy toward God, right? And when it comes to faith in the world that we live in today, we have to decide, okay, what's it going to be? Am I going to be an individual? Am I going to be an individual who allows my faith to be expressed, what I believe? Am I going to live that out? Or am I, hey, I believe this, I want to do this, but because of the people that I find myself around, maybe my workplace, since most of us in here probably have a job of some sort, because of that, you know what? I would rather get the honor. I would rather get the praise. I would rather like to be accepted by the people around me. And so I will give in to that instead. So that's a choice you have to make. And for Moses says, you know what, I'm going to refuse to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. That means, you know what, that I'm going to give up a lot of honor. I'm going to give up a lot of privilege. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14 says, do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers, for what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness? Or what fellowship has light with darkness? What fellowship or what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness, or what fellowship does light have with darkness? And I think as God's people today need to think about that. What fellowship should we as the people who are trying to walk in the light have with the world around us? And sometimes I think we're guilty of falling into fellowshipping with the world to the extent that we cower down in our faith, and we're not as open about our faith, and we don't live out our faith maybe the way that we normally would, because we're being influenced by the darkness around us. And there's a lot of that in the world today. So here Moses is, and Moses refuses to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. But look at verse 25. Choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin. This is a verse that I find interesting. Choosing rather, notice it says, he chose to be mistreated than enjoying the pleasures of sin. So going back to this idea, okay, Moses is refusing to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. So what does that mean? What is it that he's refusing? What is it that he's giving up? Well, he's giving up honor and power. And number two, he's giving up comfort and pleasure. I've never lived in a palace. I live in a nice house. But I imagine the palace is a little bit nicer than the house I've lived in, right? I imagine that the pleasures that I enjoy and have the opportunity to enjoy in life, they're at one level. But if you're the grandson of the king of Egypt at the time when they were at the height, some of the height of their power, I would say that's on a totally different level. That's on another level, so to speak. And Moses was willing to give that up. It says Moses was willing rather to be mistreated with God's people than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. I want you to think about this for just a moment. Moses chose to walk away and give that up and essentially be mistreated. Essentially, he's going to spend 40 years living in the desert doing some shepherd work. Eventually, he's going to spend 40 years in the wilderness leading people around, a bunch of complainers who are always complaining about going back to Egypt. This is what he chose. He made this choice to side with God and his people over this comfort and pleasure that he had. But what if Moses would have just said, you know what? I'm next in line. I could be king. So you know what? I'll just deal with it right now. I'll just endure being called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. All the things that comes with it. And someday I'll get my place. Maybe I'm king over Egypt, and then I can take care of my own people. Why didn't he do that? Why didn't he wait it out? I mean, he could have done a lot of good, I think, had he come to power for his own people. But he didn't want to do that. He chose to suffer with his own people. He chose to identify with his own people. He realized the joy and pleasure that comes from sin is fleeting. I think this is one of those things that we hope young people will learn sooner rather than later. But then we grow up and sometimes we struggle with learning this lesson as well, right? Because you think about what the picture that is painted of sin in the world today. And when I look at the picture that the world paints of sin, it's usually not that sin is bad. It's usually not that sin is boring, right? The picture that is painted of sin is what? What do they show us? That's fun. It's fun. You ever seen I think about like, the commercials with like the beer commercials. Like it's always people. There's a group of people, and they're always good looking. And they're always smiling, and they're always laughing, and they're always having a good time. But you never see the depression that it can lead to. You never see the car accidents that take. They don't show you that on the TV because they want to paint this picture of, hey, it's all good, it's all fun. Some of you may remember. I remember when I was younger, they used to do the drug commercial. It would come on TV. I don't think it comes on TV anymore. But it was like, this is your brain, right? And you're like, yeah. And they're like, this is your brain on drugs. And it's like an egg that's scrambling or something, right? And I was like, oh, I'm never doing drugs, like scary, I was like, that's what we should talk about when we talk about sin. Like, hey, this sin, yeah, it may be fun for a season, but it's fleeting, and there's a lot of consequences that come from it. But instead, the picture that the world sees is, hey, it brings you joy, it brings you happiness, it brings you friends. And Moses could have had all that, but he gave that up. And instead, he made the choice to be mistreated with God's people because he understood this. Well, we learn about faith. Well, we learn that faith sees that sin may be fun, but it's temporary. That's what Moses teaches us. Yeah, sin can be fun, but it's a very temporary moment. I did a lot of dumb things growing up. Most of us probably did. And in the moment, when you're doing those, I had a lot of fun. And then I got home, and my parents found out, and it wasn't fun anymore. There was consequences to bear. I had Brother Brian Lewis's aunt as my fourth grade teacher, and I was an angel in her class because she went to church with me. But I had other teachers that didn't go to church with me. And you're not going to believe it, but I wasn't always the best student. And I wasn't always the kid that would be sitting on the front row giving his full attention. I would sometimes be very disruptive. And man, it was fun to do that. And it was fun when people would laugh about it. And it was fun to shoot spitwads. Did y'all do that? We'd take the mechanical pencil and we'd take that part out and we'd use the outside part of it and we'd put it in, and the teacher would leave the room and we would draw, I shouldn't blame it on myself, we would draw a bullseye on the board and we would spit wads at. Did y'all do that? No, just us and Homewall? Okay, we were weird. But we did that. It was fun until the teacher came back and said, who did this? And then you get pointed out and you have to go to the principal's office, and back then you'd get a paddling, It wasn't fun anymore, Yeah, sin can be fun for a period of time, but eventually it runs out, right? There are consequences. That pleasure is temporary. Faith understands that, right? Moses understood that. Hey, I'd rather be mistreated with God's people rather than enjoying all the pleasures of sin that come, because I know they're temporary. 1 John chapter 2, verse number 15 says, do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world. And the world is passing away along with its desires. But whoever does the will of God abides forever. Notice what it says. Okay, we're told at the beginning, what are we not to do? Okay, well, you're not to love the world, or, what's he say? Or the things of the world, okay? Now, here's what he wants us to know. John says, I want you to know, don't love the world and don't love the things of the world. And he basically puts them in three categories, right? The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, or the ESV says the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, or he says the pride of life. Basically, those three aspects cover most of the things of the world, sin and things that we're talking about tonight. But look what he says at the end. Because the world, the things that he says don't love, he says it's doing what? It's passing away. In other words, it's not going to last. And too often, we get sucked into this world thinking that all the pleasures of this world and all of the things that we strive for and we chase, that they're going to last. Oh, they're going to bring me so much pleasure. They're going to bring me so much happiness. And it's just going to take me through my life. And it's not. Eventually, it's going to run out. The old saying is, eventually the game ends, right? And it all goes back in the box, so to speak. Kind of like that game of life that people used to play, right? Like eventually, yeah, it's fun for a while, but eventually it ends. The game ends. You don't take that stuff with you. Here Moses was, and Moses demonstrates to us that faith realizes sin is temporary. But there's a third thing I want us to see here in Hebrews chapter 11 about the faith of Moses. It says in verse 26, he considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt. Now just stop right there and think about what this is talking about. It says he considered. The word considered there means that he calculated it. You might use the phrase like he counted the cost. But basically he calculated this, and he came to conclude that the reproach. What's the word reproach mean? What's the word reproach mean? Rejection? Yeah. The idea of reproach is the idea of shame, right? You talk about rejection, that would apply, but the idea of shame, he considered the reproach, the shame of Christ, right? Of being associated with God and his people. Because remember, God's people at this point in time are what? They're slaves. They're not even free people, right? And right now, not only are they slaves, but they're slaves who are being worked very bitterly, right? They're being worked very harshly, right? And yet he calculated the cost, and he says, you know what? The shame that comes of being with Christ, his people, is greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt. What's he saying? What's he talking about? Heaven's more important than anything else? Yeah, it ends there talking about, for he was looking forward to the reward. What is it that Moses was refusing, right? He refused honor and power. He refused, comfort and pleasure. What's he refusing? Maybe to be king?
They might be sitting around drinking, but I get iced tea or water. You can tell you're not really part of that group. They won't say anything.
Yeah.
There'll be other times like the company's using money to promote all the gay pride stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I've lost jobs over those. But you got to send emails, say you're not going to take company money, profits, that I'm helping you make. And you go through very respectfully. And we can't be attached to this corporate ladder that we're trying to go up. We can't worry about, I've gotten myself in debt, I got to have this money. I think about teachers, how did all this perverted stuff get in our elementary schools and libraries? Why aren't people looking for this? We don't want our lives in trouble. But we have to go in there saying we know it's going to. We can't worry about it. And we got to look for these things. And we got to make a difference. We're the ones stopping culture from declining.
Right, yeah. Christians play a big part in that. It's the idea, basically doing the same thing, right? You're considering, you're counting the costs, right? You're calculating, okay, what's it worth? Well, my influence is worth a lot, right? Because once I give up my influence, once I lose my influence amongst people, maybe my coworkers or whoever it is that I'm trying to influence, once I lose that, it's hard to get it back, right? Moses on this occasion, right, he's giving up, he's refusing to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, and ultimately what he's saying is I would rather be with God and his people because that's worth more than all the treasures, all the riches of Egypt. Ultimately, he's refusing riches, but he's also refusing relationships, right? Because, he's leaving, so he's leaving his adopted mother, right? He's leaving his adopted grandfather. He's leaving friends that he had spent 40 years making, right? He's leaving all that because he's choosing to be with God's people. Why would he make that choice? Well, what's it say at the end of verse 26? What's he doing? looking forward to a reward. We might say it this way. Moses looked beyond the temporal into the eternal. I want you to open your Bible to Hebrews chapter 11. Well, you're already there. I need to open my Bible to Hebrews chapter 11. I want you to see something. This is backing up. This was a couple weeks ago. Billy probably hit on this a couple weeks ago in his class, I'm thinking. But you start off this chapter about what faith is, and then you get into starting to name the people by faith Enoch, and by faith Abram, and by faith Sarah, and by faith Noah. But you get to verse 13. Look what verse 13 says. And I've always found this so interesting because to me it's almost like the writer of Hebrews pauses what he's doing. He's been talking about these people and their faith that's being demonstrated. And he pauses and he says, I just got to tell you why they're doing this. Why they're making all these decisions. Why they're doing all these difficult things. So look what he says beginning in verse 13. He says, these all died in faith, having not received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. For if they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had the opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. Why is it that all these people, why is it that by faith Noah constructed an ark? Why is it by faith that Abraham was willing to leave home and go to a land that God was going to show him? Why is it that he was willing to even offer up his son? Why is it that Sarah was willing to believe that God could give her a son when she was 90 years old? Why did they do things that were difficult? And it's not just those, all the people that we're reading about for the rest of Hebrews chapter 11. The answer is in verses 13 through 16. They did what they did because they understood they were strangers and exiles on this earth. They were looking forward to something greater, a better country, the Hebrew writer says. That was what their desire was for. They understood what Paul says in Philippians chapter 3 and verse 20, where Paul says, our citizenship is in heaven. It's not here in America. Your citizenship as a child of God is heaven. And we need to never forget that. Moses demonstrates for us the idea of seeing past the temporal and looking to eternal. That's what faith does. It looks beyond this life and it looks to the eternal reward. That's why we make the decisions that we make. That's why we make the choices we make, right? I make the spiritual choices that I make. I act the way that I do when I'm around coworkers maybe who are not doing things that they should be doing. Why? Because I desire a better country. My eyes are focused on eternity. I want to think about what is to come because that's where my citizenship is. And I think one of the reasons that as humans that we find ourselves getting in so much trouble sometimes with sin and the struggles that we have and even missed opportunities when it comes to evangelizing, because we've been talking a lot about that this year. I think the reason that a lot of times we struggle with those things is because we forget where our citizenship is. We live as if, hey, this is it. But, we sing that song, this world is not my home. I'm just a passing through, right? However long that may be, right? So we have to remember where our citizenship is. Faith looks beyond this life, and it looks to the eternal reward. Moses didn't just choose to refuse identity with the world, but he chose to identify with God's people. And I think that's so important for us to consider. That it wasn't just that he said, hey, I'm not going to be associated with Egypt. I'm not going to be associated with the Pharaoh. I'm going to give that life up. He did that. But then he chose to identify and to suffer with the slave people. He made the choice. I think about, as a sports fan. Everybody, if you're a sports fan, you got your favorite team, right? And we try to find ways to identify with our teams, right? We'll wear shirts with their logo and their colors and their whatever on it. We'll have hats, right? We'll get decals for our car. We'll do all these things because we won't be, hey, I identify with these people. If you ask the people last week at camp, hey, who's Justin's favorite team? They can all tell you. They know. It's pretty obvious, right? Because I try to find ways to identify with them, and I want you to know that I identify with them. But what about when it comes to God and his people? Do I want people to know that I identify with them, that I'm a Christian? Faith chooses to identify with God and his people no matter the consequences. We shouldn't be afraid to say, hey, I choose to be on the side of the Lord. I choose to walk with him. That's the choice Moses made. It wasn't just that he refused Egypt. It wasn't just that he walked away. It was that he made the choice to say, hey, I stand with Yahweh. That's whose side I'm on. So as we wrap up tonight, I want you to think about this as we go through this next week. What will our choices this week reveal about the value that God holds in our lives? Because the choices we make reveal what is of value to us, what we value. What about what we value when it comes to God? When people look at my life, do the choices that I make demonstrate, hey, God, God's people, the church, that's what I value. Moses made a choice. He gave up the riches, the relationships, the comfort, the pleasure, the honor, and the power because he wanted to identify with God and his people. That's what faith does. Let's close with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you, Lord, for all that you do for us. Help us, Father, as we go through this life, Father, to be people of faith, people who live out our faith, people who are willing to identify with you and your people and the church, people who identify with your word, Father. Help us to make choices that reflect our values. Help us to make choices, Father, that reveal whose side we're on. Give us the courage to be brave and strong and bold as we pass through this world. And we look forward to keeping our eyes on eternity when we get to be with you forever. It's in Christ's name we pray. Amen. Have a great week.